Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Prepare for Impact, 3 key questions about RDA for every SPED administrator with Dr. Alan Coulter. I'm Clay Whitehead, the co-CEO and co-founder of Presence Learning. We provide live online speech therapy, occupational therapy, behavior intervention, and evaluation services to school districts in 40 states. This webinar is the 3rd and final installment of our Fall SPED Expectations series. Earlier this fall, we heard from Julie Weatherly, an expert on special education law, who shared her tips for staying out of due process. In late October, Dr. Barry Prezant joined us to discuss strategies for educators to improve engagement and collaboration with families. One thing families and educators have in common is their desire that all students achieve at their highest level. But while almost every state meets the requirements of IDEA, high dropout rates and poor achievement in math and reading still plague special education programs. With results-driven accountability, or RDA, the way special education programs are evaluated and funded is shifting dramatically toward being able to prove that our investments in special education services are producing results. That is, measurable improvements in student achievement. Results-driven accountability is really a new frontier for special ed. Like a mission to Mars, RDA is a bold challenge. Also, like a mission to Mars, RDA will require big thinking, creativity, and lots of work to be successful. But what does this mission to Mars mean for district leaders? We're very excited to dive into this topic with you today. Should you have any questions for Alan during the webinar, please submit them in the chat box and he will answer as many as time permits following his presentation. We'd also like to invite you to join the conversation about this webinar on Twitter using the hashtag SPEDAhead, where we'll be live tweeting Alan's presentation. And now, I'd like to formally introduce today's speaker, Dr. Alan Coulter. Alan is an expert in special education accountability and has worked at the federal, state, and local level on accountability issues for over 25 years. He has served on the President's Commission on Excellence in Special Education and is currently the Director of Education Initiatives and an Associate Professor at Louisiana State University's Health Sciences and Human Development Center. Alan is the Director of the TIERS Group. That's TIERS Intervening Early to Reach All Students. TIERS consults with state DOEs and district administrators on the quality and use of special education data. Alan is a key participant in the national discussion regarding results-driven accountability and focused monitoring. His scholarly work and research is widely published in academic journals. Welcome to Presence Learning. Alan, it's all yours.
Thanks very much, Clay, for that introduction. I really appreciate the opportunity to address this important topic today. And I appreciate Presence Learning's support of the entire SPED Ahead program. There are 4 parts to this webinar. First, I want to explain the context, how we got to this point in special education, and what sets us up for a shift in accountability. Secondly, we'll talk about results-driven accountability, the new federal initiative, and its shift in emphasis for schools. In Part 3, I'll explain each aspect of RDA and what's happening this year. I'll give you some examples from states for each. In Part 4, I'll offer 3 questions you need to ask about RDA: how you can prepare for impact, what you can do to be ready, and what you can do to take advantage. So consider what got us to this context today. What is it in our history that brought us to where we are? And for most of us, you go back really about 39 years in federal legislation, because that was the point in time, 1975, when the federal government took on a major role in special education. That legislation, we all know those famous 5 digits, 94-142. Many of us that were working in schools at that time went to lots of in-service, etc. But I think it's important quickly, even though we all know it, to revisit the 4 purposes of the law. The first purpose, as you can see on the screen, was to provide a free, appropriate public education. The acronym FAPE, F-A-P-E. It's actually become a word in the lexicon of many educators today. But that free, appropriate public education was to provide special education services and related services to meet the unique needs of a child. This was the individual entitlement that Julie Weatherly described so well for you in that first webinar, where she talked about all of the different requirements of the law and all the litigation that has come as a result of it. And in fact, for most of us, that very first purpose for us set up the obligation to find students with disabilities. And that child find effort, as you can see from the data, really set us up from a point of finding, locating, and evaluating students. And in the history, the first 25 years, as you can see, the prevalence of children, students with disabilities, has progressively risen. So that by the time we got to 2001, we had almost 7 million students with disabilities in this country receiving special education services, receiving also that individual education program that gets documented on paper. The second purpose for us was to, in fact, assure the rights of children and disabilities and their parents. As Julie Weatherly described, this individual entitlement set up not just a set of obligations for schools, but also the due process requirements of the law, that when conflicts occurred, when there were disagreements that could not be worked out, that parents had the right of due process. And in fact, early on, lots of disputes resulted in litigation, which, as Julie described, help us clarify exactly what our obligations were. And in that particular instance, as you can see from these data, and these data actually are just the last 10 years or so, from 2004, 2005 to 2011, 2012, the most recent data that we have, the number of disputes have progressively decreased. Now, it's important to point out when you look at this image, the dark blue line at the bottom of the graph is all of the other states with the exception of 3 entities and the number of disputes. As you can see, the number of disputes relatively has been small, and in fact, it's stayed relatively stable. More importantly, even disputes in the high dispute states like New York, like the island of Puerto Rico or the District of Columbia, even that number of disputes has decreased significantly. So in many instances, what Barry Prezant talked about during the second webinar in this series, involving families, collaborating with parents, increasing their engagement, all of those things have come together to help make this law really work for us. Third purpose was to look at, in fact, how the federal government could take on a major role in assisting states and local school districts in providing that free, appropriate public education. And the federal government, Congress gave the federal government resources in the formation of a technical assistance and dissemination network. That technical assistance and dissemination network exists today, and in fact, as you can see, every state in the country, every governmental entity responsible for implementing the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act has access to technical assistance. And all of those technical assistance entities offer those services on a virtually free basis. All school districts and states have to do is to volunteer or indicate a need for that particular service. The fourth purpose, however, is the heart of the matter, because the law also required the federal government and states and local school districts to assess and assure that what was being provided in special education was in fact being effective to meet the needs that Congress had determined. And to do that initially, what the Office of Special Education Programs, at that time called the Bureau of Education for the Handicapped, did was they looked at the paperwork. They looked at those individual education program documents, and as you can see here, they started out in 1978 looking at 6,000 to 7,000 IEPs, And that was the basis by which they determined whether or not the law was being implemented as it was intended in states and local school systems. And that level of monitoring, of compliance, led us really to this issue of how many requirements are there? And if you stop and think, if the law was passed initially in 1975, and it was revised a number of times, 1986, 1990, 1999, 2004, and requirements each time the law was reauthorized were added. That led us to the state that we're in today, which is, never forget, there are more than 755 individual process requirements in the law applicable to every student identified with a disability eligible to receive special education. That creates an incredible complexity for schools to master. And in fact, it has created what I call kind of a checklist mentality. That checklist mentality really said, can we enumerate specific things that we're supposed to do, make certain that we do them, and when we do, we check them off. That checking off mentality really pretty much comprised our ways to address a fear. The fear was that if we weren't doing something right, we would be in noncompliance. And that noncompliance could somehow send us to what I like to call noncompliance jail. It doesn't exist. But people's fear, especially educators committed to doing a good job, always was backed up by the fact that when the federal government, when states monitored local schools, in some instances where things could not be efficiently corrected, corrective action plans had to occur. When lawsuits resulted in settlement agreements and or independent monitors, all of those things reinforced the burden on schools of basically trying to check off things that they were supposed to do. And as you think about it, the historic focus of special education legislation has really not been on whether or not the services were working, but rather on whether or not all the procedures were being followed. That procedural compliance dominated all of the administration of special education. So for us, in 2004, when the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was most recently reauthorized, the Office of Special Education Programs tried to simplify this compliance. And to do that, they came up with 20 indicators for schools to address. They divided those indicators into two groups. First, there was a results indicator. These results indicators, as you can see, were things like graduation rates, dropout rates, whether or not parents were involved, the outcomes of students in terms of preschool outcomes or even statewide assessments, etc. Those particular indicators were tracked and reported by states, and the federal government looked at those indicators. But it's important to know that for those indicators, none of those counted towards the assessment of compliance with the law. Rather, it was these indicators, these 7 indicators that looked at things like our child find performance, whether or not students were transitioning in their IEPs to secondary education and post-school outcomes. Those made up the basis for determining whether or not states were meeting the requirements of the law. And Congress specified in 2004 that the Office of Special Education Programs had to report on the status of implementation of the law in terms of those 7 conditions, and they had to denote whether or not states were meeting requirements, or they needed assistance, or they needed intervention, and the 4th most serious category was needs significant intervention, which required certain mandatory imposed requirements on states. For all of the states, this status determination also required them to determine the status of implementation of every local school system. It became a high-stakes annual event. And in fact, as the years went on, and here are data for 2007, you can see that the U.S. Department of Education determined, based upon a relatively narrow definition of the intent of the law, that many states were in fact meeting requirements, but the most states, as you see depicted in yellow, were really still needing some kind of assistance. That assistance, however, was in the form of, in many instances, voluntary changes in plans to improve. For all of us, it was important to note that when you looked at the item, the procedural item indicators of compliance, things had to get better. And in fact, in the last several years, things have improved. As you can see in the next data, for the compliance indicators just in the last year that is reported, 2010, compared to 2005, things have gotten better. That in fact the percent of compliance has gotten above 95% in most instances. That means for all of us, when we think about procedural compliance, things are getting better. And in fact, when we looked at child find, as you can see, the prevalence of students with disabilities all the way up through 2010, 2011 has pretty much stabilized. It's actually dropped just a little bit. That indicates to all of us that in fact child find works to identify the students with disabilities. So for most of us, this is the way the picture would look if, in fact, only procedural requirements were being reported and evaluated by the Office of Special Education Programs in 2013. But as you're going to see in Part 2, things have changed. Never forget that while there are 755 requirements, procedural requirements in the law, compliance does not in fact assure that you get better results. And if we go back to that fourth implication, that fourth purpose of the federal law, it's important to note that we have to pay attention to results, but it hasn't been something that we have been specifically paying attention to for compliance. So for most of us, you have to ask yourself the question, what's missing? And we'll deal with that in Part 2. As you'll recall, in Part 1, we wanted to provide a context for the changes that are coming. What I'd like to describe now in this second part is results-driven accountability and the reasons that the shifts are being made. As you'll notice in the screen, Arne Duncan, current Secretary of Education, has said really for too long we've been sort of a checklist-driven kind of a mentality around what we're trying to do a good job in special education. That's not to say that teachers in classrooms, administrators in schools weren't trying to do everything they possibly could to try and make that education effective. It's just that they also had to pay attention to lots of procedures that they needed to address. And in that compliance-driven bureaucracy, I think a number of people, including advocates, but most importantly the U.S. Department of Education, they decided, hey, it's time to make a change. We have to revisit, in fact, that purpose of special education legislation. And as you can see on the screen, it's really about that national policy of preparing individuals with disabilities through schooling for independence, economic self-sufficiency, and really being meaningful contributors to their community. In doing that, the Office of Special Education Programs, the Department of Education, is now shifting its emphasis to really improving educational results and functional outcomes, while at the same time obviously requiring those particular things in the law that schools have to do. part of the foundation for this is really around looking at what has happened in all of our efforts to try and provide a meaningful education to students with disabilities. As you can see on these data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress 2013, there's a significant gap between the performance of students with IEPs compared to other students. That comparison, that achievement gap between students with and without disabilities is driving a change in the emphasis of what is important in special education. These data, as you can see, are for reading and math. At the 4th grade, you can also see that over time, that gap has been maintained. So despite the fact that we have consistently improved in the implementation of procedural compliance in special education, the actual effects upon students and their families really hasn't changed. And that, in fact, we have a significant gap both in 4th grade achievement, as you can see here, as well as 8th grade achievement levels. And in fact, the gap is greater as students get older in their schooling experience. For us, the ultimate outcome of schooling always has to be a student with disabilities exit from school ready and prepared to enter the world of work, enter post-school outcomes, college, etc. And that indicator typically is tracked by diploma rates, high school graduation. And as you can see here, the average for students with disabilities in the United States receiving a high school diploma is 63.5%, but more importantly, look at the range across the states. And so while we've done much, much better in procedural compliance, our attainment of results for students with disabilities has not kept pace with that steadily improving trend that you see in procedural compliance. So the Office of Special Education Programs, taking the reauthorization of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 2004, decided to make a shift. And this is where the implementation of IDEA is going, and that's why it's so important for you to remember how things are going to change for you in schools. You'll recall we talked about the fact that the balance was always on procedural requirements, but right now it's going to shift. Beginning in 2013 and continuing through to the future, we've really shifting the balance away from just procedural outcomes. They still are important, but much more of an emphasis upon whether or not students are learning. Hence, when Barry was talking to you in the second webinar about how to involve families, it was so important to remember that the increase in family involvement is almost always accompanied by increases in student outcomes and whether or not students are getting more from the services that we're providing. So for us, once again, the emphasis needs to be upon whether or not the services are effective for students, and if they're not, how we make changes, while at the same time maintaining that item compliance, that procedural compliance, that for the most part states have been able to achieve at least a 90-95% compliance rate or higher. For us, remember that map. If in fact procedural compliance in 2013 had been the only requirement for states, the states would have overall looked very good. Look at the number of states that would have been in the green as opposed to states in yellow, and in fact very few indications of any states in red, namely needing intervention. However, that's not the status determination that was used under now what is called results-driven accountability. Rather, the picture looks like this. Results-driven accountability is in fact going to impose upon states additional requirements and therefore upon their local schools to improve. because the status under results-driven accountability of most states is in fact around needing assistance, and the two largest states in terms of student enrollment are actually now classified as needs intervention. This drives for us three principles in results-driven accountability. The first is obviously to align as much of our efforts as possible around what's most likely to improve results and reduce that achievement gap that we just saw. Secondly, we want to reduce the reporting burden, this whole emphasis upon the documentation, etc., to what is minimally required by the law, while at the same time trying to report data that are sensitive to the results of students and how students with disabilities are performing compared to their typical peers. This change in focus for the states in terms of their state performance report and their annual performance report, that particular set of documentation that states provide basically now points states towards looking at what's going on in schools that's most likely to produce a result in achievement. So with that in mind, here now are the three indicators, rather than those procedural compliance indicators. Here are the three indicators that states are being asked to pay attention to, and therefore schools need to pay attention. And that is, in fact, first, graduation rates. To what extent do students with disabilities graduate with a high school diploma? Next, assessment, the high stakes or the standard assessments that are being used by states to evaluate student progress. Are students with disabilities steadily improving? And then lastly, to what extent are students who exit, students with disabilities who leave school, are they transitioning on to satisfactory post-school outcomes? Namely, are they either working, on the job, employed in meaningful employment, going to post-secondary education in terms of community colleges, regular colleges, or transitioning into the military? Those indicators also now require an additional indicator, and that indicator is number 17, the State Systemic Improvement Plan. And the reason to pay close attention to this is because this is going to be the written document that states use each year to describe how they are supporting local school systems in improving their particular results. Because it's things that are being reported about you, we want you to pay particular attention to how states develop and report on their systemic, planful efforts to improve. With that in mind, beginning in fiscal year 2013-14, which will be reported on this coming February, states were required to do a thorough data analysis of what's happening across school systems in their state. They were required to identify, and here's a new acronym for you, if in fact you haven't heard it before, they were required to identify a state-identified measurable result, namely something that indicated a change in results for students. It could not be an improvement in the percentage of procedural requirement. It had to be something related to achievement, to diploma rates, to reducing dropout rates. It had to be something that was measurable, and it had to be something that was identified by a large group of stakeholders within the state. So ask yourself, were you a member of that stakeholder group? If in fact you weren't, the first question to ask yourself is, what is my state's state-identified measurable result? States were also required to do something particularly shrewd, and that is to look at their structure, their infrastructure for getting things done and supporting schools, and to denote any weaknesses or things that needed to be improved in state infrastructure, the bureaucracy, if you will. And in fact, many states are taking moves to try and better integrate all their federal programs so that programs are talking to each other. Next, they were supposed to design an improvement plan that would both sustain or build, at least, student achievement, as well as build the capacity of schools to deal with the increasing diversity of student populations and the increasing challenges as it relates to trying to improve achievement. To do that, they had to construct, each state had to construct a theory of action. A theory of action, briefly stated, is an if-then statement. In other words, our theory of why things are happening is if something occurs, then we think we will get better results. If we do these particular things, and we can enumerate them, then students with disabilities will in fact improve in their achievement, in their diploma rates, etc., whatever the state designated as its state-identified measurable result. That first phase, as I said, has to be publicly reported to the U.S. Office of Education in February 2015, but that's just the first phase. The second phase, beginning in February 2016 as it's reported, but actually we're in phase 2 right now, is to in fact start to take steps to improve the infrastructure. Second, to support local agency implementation of evidence-based practices. The reason that's important to you is that states are supposed to designate resources that they are using, federal resources, state resources, whatever, in order to try and help local school systems get better results. And lastly, they have to develop and begin to use a plan to evaluate whether or not the activities that they are conducting, whether or not what schools are doing is in fact proving to be effective. Now, phase 3, as you can see on the screen, really begins in fiscal year 2015-16, and it is a logical extension of what they planned to do in phase 1, what they started to do in phase 2, and now for the next 5 years, reporting on progress, evaluating the results, making changes, tweaking what needs to be done in order to get better results. That's that indicator. This graphic shows you that this isn't a special education effort alone. In fact, the U.S. Office of Education has basically taken all of its federal programs and asked them to make a shift towards improved results. So as you can see, there are school turnaround programs supported by the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, results-driven accountability, which is supported by the Office of Special Education Programs, and what's called ESEA Flex, that whole area around the Elementary and Secondary Education Act related to waivers, etc. All of those things now are supposed to be focusing on not procedural compliance, although it'll never go away, but shifting the emphasis towards getting better results. So for us, what we need to think about now is knowing that results-driven accountability is a federal requirement imposed upon states and emphasized. Stop and think, what are going to be the implications for you? And that's what we're going to deal with in Part 3. And now, let's get specific. Let's see how this shift to RDA is actually impacting states and districts around the country. Let's look at what's happening in Phase 1. Phase 1 of results-driven accountability includes 5 steps. I described those for you briefly before, but now I want to give you just a little bit more detail and give you some examples from states. In data analysis, the first step, this is where states are going to work with the data that they've been collecting over the past 25 to 35 years. Most importantly, the data pretty much over the last 5 years or so. However, OSEP defines data analysis as looking at key data because, in fact, there is a great deal of information and data that have been collected, not all of which are going to be pertinent to the improvement of results. So in doing that, I want you to think about not jumping to a conclusion just based upon one single piece of data. As a matter of fact, what OSEP requires states to do is to look at multiple data sources, to look at data in a variety of different ways, disaggregated by grade, by race and ethnicity, by gender, etc., just to look at data more deeply. However, many people take data on face value, and educators have been particularly keen in questioning the quality of data that is sometimes collected in schools. So OSEP asks states to examine the quality of each data element that they are analyzing and to make a judgment about whether or not the quality of the data are sufficient to actually draw a conclusion. Now, typically in results-driven accountability, people are only looking at data about results, but OSEP gives one particular caution, and that is data have been collected over the last 9 years related to compliance and whether or not citations are given at a district level, what are the most frequent citations within different categories, and whether or not corrections have been made so that non-compliance no longer exists in a particular district. Data about compliance is just as useful in many instances as results-driven accountability when trying to determine exactly what the target's going to be. Lastly, and I'm going to give you some good examples of this, states are asked to look at trends and patterns in their data. To do that, let me take you to the state of Alabama. Alabama has done a very good job of looking at their data, and these are data on reading. So as you can see, for students with disabilities, 2012-13 and 2012-13 for math, reading and math, you're looking at participation rates for students with disabilities, very high, a good sample, in other words. But look at the performance of students. Notice that 48.67%, 47.25% were actually proficient. Now, that's data for students with disabilities. So you're looking at performance where about 1 out of 2 kids is actually performing at the level that we would expect. Alabama took a few more steps, however, in looking at their data. They also examined data in terms of one group over continuous years. So what I've highlighted for you here is the same group of students in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, in other words, beginning in 2010, ending in 2013, and as you can see, as students with disabilities were entering that middle school set of years, their performance began to drop. That particular trend is very, very helpful in looking at what should be emphasized. Look at another data point. This is the proficiency data for students with disabilities in the state of Alabama within the same year. So, for instance, this is 2011-12. As you can see, 6th graders, 7th graders, 8th graders, compared to typical students, the drop is progressive. Even though typical students are dropping, they're dropping not quite at the same rate, but it's the gap. It's that emphasis on the gap that, in fact, results-driven accountability is trying to target. If you look at the next year, 2012-13, same trend, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, same level of gap. So that's a little bit about achievement performance. Now consider another important variable, diploma rate. I'm going to give you data now from the state of Idaho, but first let's talk about how do you calculate diploma rate, because in fact there are 2 or 3 different methods for doing that. In this particular instance, this is the special education method typically used with special education data, which is to look at the number of students ages 14 through 21 in a given year that exit with a diploma compared to exiting with a diploma, receiving a certificate of achievement, reaching maximum age, which is up through age 21, and dropping out of school. That's what's included in the denominator. What's not included, as you can see, is whether or not the student with disability died, moved or not known to be continuing in special education, or transferred to general education, namely no longer eligible for special education services. So if you think about that, that calculates for you a percentage. Now here's Idaho's data. As you see, Idaho wanted to compare itself to all states in the West, or at least the states in their western region. On the far right, you see the national average. That's 38% of all students with disabilities exiting with a diploma for the U.S. and the outlying areas. And then look at the western states and find Idaho. Idaho is that blue bar that you see just to the right of the center of the screen. And there the graduation rate for students with disabilities in 2009, 2010 was 25.8%. In other words, about 1 out of every 4 students with a disability in Idaho exiting school received a high school diploma. Next, you can compare that trend for Idaho across a number of years. This is a 5-year trend study, and as you can see, the national average was about a 4.9% increase over that 5-year period in diplomas. For Idaho, it's a slight decrease. In effect, really not much of a change, if any, across those 5 years. Look at the bar on the far left. That's the state of Washington. They happen to be the #1 state in that 5-year trend for improving their diploma rate. So one of the things that states begin to think about is, are other states that are doing much better than us, what are they doing differently that maybe we could adopt? Think about, in fact, those trends in rates. And Idaho, when they looked at all of the states, they actually ranked 44th out of all 57 entities that receive special education funding from the federal government. Those types of data analysis form the first step in results-driven accountability. Let's shift now to this second step, which is infrastructure. If you think about just the data on performance, it doesn't tell you the whole picture. You also want to ask yourself the question, how does the way in which the state of Department of Education and or local school districts, how are they organized to get better results for students? And to do that, OSEP uses a definition of infrastructure analysis, which looks at the capacity of a system to basically support improvement and help build up the skills of the people trying to produce better results for kids. And as you can see on the image, it talks about the different components, which can be finance, it can be the standards used, it can be the amount and frequency of the professional development, technical assistance that's provided by other projects, by State Department personnel, et cetera, as well as the accountability system. How do all those things come together as an infrastructure to support better results? And here I want to introduce you to a federal project specifically dedicated to help states look at their infrastructure and to work on ways to integrate all federal programs in a way that supports better results. This particular project, the School-Wide Integrated Framework for Transformation, also known as SWIFT, is currently working in 5 states. And as they help the state look at the way in which it's organized, as they help 4 school systems in each of those states look at the way that they're organized, they're really working to try and make all those resources as integrated as possible. Here's an outcome for that. If you look at the new organizational chart for the Oregon Department of Education, you'll notice that they've organized all their programs into what they call an Office of Learning. You don't see a title for special education. You don't see a title for Title I or bilingual. All those programs come together in an integrated fashion. And in fact, you will see an increasing trend across the states at looking at their infrastructure in ways to answer the question, how can we organize ourselves to get better results. That Office of Learning is an absolute key to local school systems to approach and use their resources flexibly to do better for students and families. Let's move on now to the third step, which is the state identified measurable result. This is that key data variable or small collection of data variables that basically gives you an indication of whether or not things are working in that state, in that school system, to do better under results-driven accountability. OSEP's definition basically says, and it's just plainly spoken, it's what's the result that the state wants to get in order to do better by kids. It's also the result that's implied from doing an analysis of data and an analysis of infrastructure. It has to be a focus on outcomes. It has to in some way be a measurable result. It can be a single measure or a cluster. Now, you might ask yourself, what is my state selecting as its state identified measurable result, also known as SIMR? This is the big mystery right now. Not one state that I know of has actually declared its state identified measurable result. And in fact, the Office of Special Education Programs recently extended the deadline and gave states till April the 1st to declare their SIMR. So this will be something that you'll want to pay very careful attention to as you move on. The next step in the process is coming up with ways to improve. And here the emphasis is on coherence. When they say coherent improvement strategies, that word was not added idly. The coherence that they're expecting is really a coherence across resources. They're not just talking about, once again, this issue of special education only. No, it's how are you using all of your resources to get better results. And here I'll give you an example. They're looking for how data analysis would lead you to a particular conclusion and a very clear definition of that improvement. To do that, I'll give you an example from the state of Alabama. In this particular instance, Alabama's highlighting a project that they funded through their special education funds, specifically for professional development, a project that they call Closing the Gap. And they've looked at feeder patterns of students with disabilities and whether or not they're improving on the state's STAR assessment. And as you can see, they're documenting the fact that they have a set of improvements based upon this pilot study, and you can see they're leading up to a conclusion that in fact maybe what they want to do is to suggest a different way of doing things using something that they've learned. When they do that, they're going to pay very special attention to implementing it in a way that meets the requirements of what we've learned in implementation science. So as you think about your improvement strategies in your local school system, as you think about what the state is doing, know that there's going to be an increased emphasis on the part of the Office of Special Education Programs to use the principles of implementation science and what they call the drivers, the things that make certain that the improvement strategies that you use stick, that they sustain themselves over time. Next, I want you to think about how Alabama then is going to describe those implementation strategies. And here you can see they've talked about their project Closing the Gap as having these particular components: instructional coaching, co-teaching, emphasizing safe and civil schools, and then looking at how they can link up all their special educators into a group to basically get a better result. The last step in phase one of results-driven accountability is a theory of action. It's that if-then statement. It basically is going to describe that if the strategies that have just been talked about, if those are implemented with fidelity, then what's going to happen? And here, because I've shown you data from Alabama, I've shown you their improvement strategies, I'm going to show you their if-then statement. Their if-then statement basically says that if students with IEPs receive that instruction, if they get appropriate supports in transition, then they're going to be able to achieve positive post-school outcomes in higher education and competitive employment. If you'll recall the analysis of data that I showed you for Alabama, you noted that the drop in performance for students with disabilities started to occur in middle school, and that trend continued. You've also noted that there was a substantial gap between typical students and students with disabilities. That's what this if-then statement is seeking to address. So just to review, in Part 3, what we've tried to show you is examples and explicit definitions of each of the 5 steps in Phase 1. Data analysis plus infrastructure analysis leads you to selecting a state-identified measurable result. Then you look for improvement strategies that will, in fact, have an impact on that measurable result. And as a conclusion, you state it in a concise theory of action. That's Phase 1 of results-driven accountability, and that's what some states are doing. And that wraps up the third part of our webinar. I'd like to begin this fourth part of the webinar by asking you, how do you think results-driven accountability affects you and the work that you do in schools? And to make it more pointed, I want to pose now 3 questions. The first question is, in thinking about the district that you work in and thinking about your particular school system, what challenges do you see right now in addressing results-driven accountability? Let me give you a few things to think about. In terms of challenges, what's your performance currently in procedural compliance? And how has that performance looked over the last several years? If you've been monitored by your State Department of Education, what's the results of those monitoring visits, and what have you been asked to do in order to correct? As you think about looking at procedural compliance, what procedures do you have in place now, for instance, for training new employees in the requirements of federal and state law? What are the kinds of processes that you have in place that help people do things in a procedurally compliant and acceptable manner? Secondly, when you think about your performance on results measures, especially if you compare yourself to similar school districts or to the state average, how are you doing on those results measures that typically the Office of Special Education Programs is concerned about? So remember what those are. How are you doing in terms of comparing the achievement of students with disabilities in grades 4 and 8 and possibly other grades in your district, comparing students with disabilities to typical students? Where do you stand now? If you think about the graphs that I showed you that backed up the Office of Special Education Programs rationale, where they showed a persistent and continuing and very stable gap between students with and without disabilities, how do you stand? How does your district's performance look comparing over time students with and without disabilities? Think about achievement, think about diploma rates, think about dropout, think about suspensions and expulsions. Always comparing, using as your baseline, using as your basis of comparison, typical students to students with disabilities. And if you disaggregate among the 13 disability categories within special education, where do you see gaps or differences that are particularly glaring and alarming to you? Next, think about what's your state-identified measurable result. You see, it's that key variable that the state is going to focus on to make themselves look much better over time. Every state knows they can't improve anything. It's only the school districts and the schools in school districts that can improve performance. So it's always about the state's efforts to support you and what you do that's going to allow them to be able to report improvements in their state-identified measurable result. But let's get personal about it. So how does your district perform compared to the state's average, compared to other districts in your state with similar characteristics? Next, think about the capacity that you have to support teachers and principals now in terms of not just achieving procedural compliance, but now beginning to implement those evidence-based practices that we have good assurance will improve the results for students with disabilities. What's your capacity to do professional learning? To what extent are professional learning communities present in schools? How are data being disseminated to school staff so that they can use those data to track performance, give themselves feedback? Are staff in some ways being assisted in assessing the implementation fidelity of what they're doing so that even if they have an evidence-based practice, can they assure themselves that they're doing it the way in which it was designed to be done? And then lastly, as it relates to this kind of making it personal to you and your district, to what extent do you believe you have the capacity to keep procedural compliance at that relatively high level that states have reported, while at the same time now shifting the emphasis towards improving results? Most people find it very, very challenging to try and maintain procedural compliance at the same time as really pushing up the efforts in improving results. Remember, in schools we're always challenged by people, externals, adding things to what we do, but yet not taking anything away. So with that in mind, think about your district. Second question. As you look at it, what are the resources that you're going to need to address this shift in emphasis? Namely, in my first question, I was asking you to assess yourself and see what your status is and what you believed your needs were. Now, once knowing those needs, what kind of resources do you think you're going to require in order to get better results? And remember, the state is being required now to show the federal government how they're using the federal resources that they're being given in order to support districts in this shift. So here's a few key points for you to think about. What resources do you have now that currently emphasize improving results? Many of you already are showing very, very good achievement scores. You have good graduation rates, etc. How are the resources that you've been given targeted to maintain these results and, in fact, show improvement? Do you have identified needs of staff? Are you assessing needs for professional learning? Do you have a list right now? If nothing else, do you have a wish list of things that if you had these things, it would in fact help you to get better results? Because in many instances, as states make this shift into results-driven accountability, they're going to start thinking about where do we need to put our investments in order to get better results. Think about your data. In most instances, we are awash with data, but the issues for us are those data of good quality, and do we have methods, ways that we can display the data so that people can actually use it? That whole idea around visualizing data in ways that make it accessible to educators to use to plan improvement is an area of technical assistance that's needed in many, many school districts. Next, think about the state's commitment to professional learning and especially continuing professional learning, not just the in-service, the one-shot kind of stand-up entertainment stuff, but more around to what extent is professional learning viewed as something continuous, something that happens over time. And in your state's commitment, are there resources there that you can draw on, like webinars, like modules, etc.? And then lastly, to what extent are the costs that you are going to encounter to sustain these results How are you going to cover those costs over the next few years as this shift begins to occur? Those are all things to think about. Let me give you a third question. The third question for you is really now around how people view you, your school system, and what you're doing. Given that results-driven accountability has an inevitable transparency component, all state plans are posted on websites. All the results associated with the state-identified measurable result are going to be displayed on websites. The public information available on the performance of schools is simply going to increase. And as you think about the shift towards results-driven accountability for students with disabilities, here are some questions to ask yourself. To what extent does the state have a process whereby they determine the school district status, namely meets requirements, needs assistance, needs intervention, needs significant intervention, and in understanding that, what's the level of public disclosure that goes on? Some states disclose all that information. Other states disclose a little. Some states don't tell anyone other than the school district what the status of a particular school system is. But remember this, all of this information is subject to Freedom of Information Act. So as you think about what your status is under results-driven accountability, how are you going to manage the public disclosure and the reaction of the school system to what the public knows about what you're doing? So, next point, look at that process for dissemination, because after all, whenever there's news that troubles you, it's really important to get out in front and know how to manage it. Third, to what extent are you locally involving a large group of stakeholders in your efforts to improve results? To what extent have you identified and informed and actively involved, much as Barry talked about in his webinar of involving parents, but also key parents, to the process that you are going to put forth to try and get better results? Stakeholder involvement at both a state level as well as a local level are absolutely critical to achieving a level of broad support for the hard work that's going to have to occur in order to get better results. Lastly, the elephant in the room. We all know that special education in many instances is viewed negatively by our colleagues in general education. What are the current attitudes towards special education, and how is results-driven accountability going to make a shift there? For me, it's an extremely positive thing, because we're really now talking about special education that's going to work better to get the results that families want. That shift away from just the item compliance, making certain that you've got all the boxes checked, etc., can really be used now to leverage a more positive attitude towards special education and what special education is doing. If you think about the emphasis of the federal government of bringing Title I and special education together to really focus on improving results for all the kids that are eligible for those programs, and you think about what states might be doing to modify their infrastructure, look at the structures within your own school system to sort of see how can we use this shift to create broader support for the special programs that we are doing. Last thing for you to think about before we turn it over to you. As you think about your district, think about the good stuff that's going on now that you can highlight that shows you're on the path that supports results-driven accountability. Ask yourself this question: what are those accomplishments that we've had? What are the specific opportunities that you can see within this shift of emphasis that's really going to help you build a better, more effective, more efficient structure to meet the needs of students with disabilities? And with that, with all those things to think about, it's now time for you to add What do you think needs to be considered? Let's open it up.
Thank you, Alan. That was fantastic. You certainly have given us a lot to think about. I think we have all read about so much about RDA and heard so much about RDA. It's wonderful and refreshing to get it all boiled down with the district perspective baked in there. It's a rare angle to get on RDA and one that we very much appreciated. So we have the questions here from the audience, and I'll start with one about how to boil this down to people's states and their local circumstances. So the first question is, how do I find out what is happening in my state and what resources are available to assist us in improving achievement results, graduation rates, and dropout rates?
You know, that's a really tricky question because, in fact, information on phase one of results-driven accountability in almost anybody's state probably won't be accessible until the summer of 2015. But, you know, I can give you 3 things that you can do right now to start to learn more about what's going on with results-driven accountability. First, ask yourself, whom do you know in your state education agency that could inform you about what's happening? Obviously, personal relationships are an absolute key to getting the kind of information that you need. So think about asking that person to sort of inform you, let you know what's happening with regard, what happened with phase one. Are they on time? Have they, in fact, finished everything that they were supposed to by that June 30 deadline? Or, like many of the states, are they extending themselves more into the end of this calendar year, possibly all the way up until April the 1st, trying to pull everything together? Second, remember that we talked about stakeholder involvement. Stakeholder involvement is a very important thing that OSEP is looking for. As a matter of fact, yesterday, the Office of Special Education Programs disseminated common questions and answers about results-driven accountability. And to the question of who are the stakeholders in my state, OSEP responded that they wanted a broad participation of families, of local school personnel, of related services groups, anybody that has an interest in how special education is operating. OSEP would really like to see the state involved in their planning process to develop that state systemic improvement plan. Lastly, and this is a long shot, but for some of you, these data and information are available, and that is, look to see what presentations your state education agency may have made and posted on the web related to results-driven accountability. The data I showed you from Idaho, the data I showed you from Alabama, there are a number of states that have posted information on their websites. Mississippi has a very good presentation. Iowa's done a good one. So you can search just using a common search engine for results-driven accountability, special education in the name of your state, and just see what pops up. Good luck with that search, because as you pull information together, you want to share it with all your colleagues, because the more people know about what's going on with RDA, the more likely we are to get improved results. What's another question?
Here's the next one. With the shift to RDA, how can we best use data to enhance learning and improve outcomes? What specific data will RDA look at?
Well, you know, we've given a number of examples around those indicators for graduation rate, for student achievement, and I think that one of the things that you need to pay attention to is what are the evidence-based practices that have held up over a very long period of time. And the most important aspect of data are using the data to learn about what's going on, what's working and not working, and then using those data to implement evidence-based practices and evaluating the effect of those practices over time. The what we know now about local schools using data and using it continuously as they go through a school year, what we know now about districts using data to look at the performance of their school systems, those particular things are very important to knowing how you're doing in results-driven accountability. What's another question?
As expectations increase, it places significant pressure on students with severe learning disabilities and others to achieve. How can we assist them when they are struggling every day just to keep up with their peers?
You know, I think that especially for students with severe learning disabilities, the most important thing that adults can do is to help model for them how to organize their time, how to use that time wisely. I think that while there is a heavy emphasis on academic achievement, we also need to pay attention to the social emotional needs of these children. Because in many instances, if we ignore the social emotional needs, we're not going to get the kind of performance and achievement that we really want. So adults can do a lot to model for students with significant disabilities how to handle yourself in challenging situations. Give me another one.
Alan, just to follow up to that one, do you have any tips on dealing with parents as many of them will naturally respond with this similar type of question here? My kid is already having so many challenges, this shift is unfair, or I'm struggling with this shift, or we're struggling with this shift. Do you have any tips and tricks on introducing this to parents?
Well, I hope the audience was also attending for Barry Prezant's presentation and his webinar. But to whatever extent we can enhance our relationships with families and helping them to understand their children as learners, to also help them work at home to reinforce what we're doing at school, that simply advantages that child in doing much better in school. So I would say that we know a lot about how to work with families. We don't always use what we know. And I think starting with Barry's words is a great way to get going.
Wonderful. We have a great question from the audience here. They're asking about the role of the general education teacher. What role does the general education teacher have in the RDA process when our students are in full inclusion?
Well, I think inclusive practices are a key to helping students not just with their academics, but also with their social emotional learning and getting along with typical peers. I think general education teachers, the very first thing that obviously they need to do is to allocate some time to coordinate and collaborate with their special education teacher colleagues. The level of collaboration, the frequency of co-teaching, what we've learned about just simply being able to work with each other as professionals is really important. And general education sets the tone in a school for how learning is going to take place. So general educators, general education teachers in particular, are very, very important to making certain that students with disabilities, who after all are members of that school community, that those students are incorporated in every aspect of what goes on in school and they feel a part of that school. General education teachers are absolutely essential to getting better results for kids with disabilities.
Wonderful. So could you talk a little bit about how RDA affects general education teachers differently than the IEP process?
Well, I think that the IEP process in particular is one that tends to have focused on how do you plan for individual students with disabilities in the context primarily of special education procedures. General education teachers can take a role almost immediately by looking at the data of typical students to students with disabilities at their grade level and their particular subject matter. I think that general education teachers need to take a systemic approach to looking not so much at individual students, although that's really important for the kids that they teach, but as members of the school community. They want to pay attention to all of the students with disabilities and how their performance is matching up. So in all of the things that you think about that could be applied to a general education student by a general education teacher, those same considerations ought to apply to a student with a disability.
Interesting. And you talked about data and the role of sharing information and how important that is. Do you think that our current IEP systems and student information systems are up to the challenge of facilitating these types of discussions, Alan?
Well, I think the student data systems right now, first of all, we need to have very careful considerations about data quality. To what extent do the student data systems, and there usually are several, some for achievement, some for attendance and demographics, others for discipline, to what extent do all those data systems talk to each other, and to what extent are those data systems accurate? Suspension and expulsion data typically is notoriously inaccurate and of poor quality. The judgments that we make about the data first have to be, I think, weighed in light of the quality of the data that we're looking at. Secondly, a lot of people collect data. Very few people use those data systematically over time. And so the use of data action teams supported by school administrators is one of the most durable, persistently successful activities that schools can do, and yet not a lot of schools actively engage in data action teams over time.
Great. How can districts use RDA concepts to improve student learning? How is RDA different from or similar to RBA? And so that was an audience question. I'm going to ask you to explain what RBA is real briefly as well.
You know, I think that results-driven accountability, much like a number of school reform procedures, really emphasize the use of evidence-based practices and evidence-based practices with fidelity. I think another very important aspect of what's going on in schools is related to the use of implementation science, trying to involve all the parties that need to implement something in the decision-making around what gets selected to implement and how it's going to be supported over time. So the concepts of results-driven accountability really bring to bear a number of things that are going on across education today. The sort of commingling, if you will, of all the resources in a coordinated fashion, the coherence of ideas around what's going to work with students with disabilities. Most of those things, in fact, are just as effective with typical students. So trying to bring things together rather than operate things in silos, that's a very important concept, not just with results-driven accountability, but with pretty much the evaluation of any of the federal resources that are being brought into schools.
Interesting. Would you mind sort of comparing and contrasting RDA with RTI for us? And I realize that's quite a large question, but if I'm a school and I'm thinking about the magnitude of the change and the timeline, so those two specific aspects, the magnitude of the change and the timeline, is it a bigger challenge and a longer challenge to implement RDA than RTI?
Well, response to intervention or response to instruction and intervention, I mean, the term's used widely across states. It's also called multi-tiered systems of support. Those concepts apply to all kids in school. Results-driven accountability is really directed to students with disabilities, but the emphasis is the same, and that is, how can all students be successful? How can we reduce the gap in performance across all the various groups? So results-driven accountability and multi-tiered systems of support, or RTI, are absolutely compatible and very much reinforce a coherence at the school level that we're all basically working together to improve the performance of all students, not just my students versus your students, but pretty much how can we work together to make certain that we get better results for all the kids. I don't see any conflict whatsoever between RTI, MTSS versus results-driven accountability. They are simply different aspects of the same general focus.
And as an administrator thinking back to implementing maybe an RTI or MTSS program, am I going to find RDA simpler, harder, more complex? How would you characterize it for our audience?
Well, I think whether or not RDA is simple or complex to implement at the local school level really starts with what the state is going to select as its state identified measurable result. And what resources are the states going to allocate to local schools in order to help them focus on that state identified measurable result. So that's why I really want to emphasize a stakeholder involvement on the part of everybody on the phone. To whatever extent that you feel that that results-driven accountability is something that affects you, that ought to increase the fervor that you have towards getting involved in your state and how the plan's going to be developed, and most importantly, what kind of resources you can expect from the state to help you get the job done.
That's excellent color. So let's think at the local directors level. How can they identify quality strategies and programs that can help reduce the achievement gap?
Well, there are a number of technical assistance agencies that serve states that also serve local school systems. And I think, once again, as you get involved in the planning process, the state's going to identify a number of those evidence-based practices. As they do that, those are resources that you ought to be able to access as well. Obviously, the U.S. Department of Education has the Institute for Education Sciences, which evaluates the effectiveness of a variety of innovations and products, etc. But for the most part, you want to build strong linkages with your state education agency, with national and state associations like Council for Exceptional Children, ASHA, National Association of School Psychologists. A number of those national and state associations also are heavily involved in identifying evidence-based practices to address particular needs. The thing that you want to do at the local level is to look so closely at your data that you come up with a very carefully constructed challenge or problem statement. That helps people much more carefully target what the evidence-based practice is that could be applied to the situation that you've identified.
Wonderful. So let's talk about related services. How does RDA impact related service professionals like SLPs, OTs, school psychologists, and so on?
You know, I'm a recovering school psychologist myself. I haven't actually done it in a while, but that's the theoretical orientation I come from. Before that, I was a teacher in high school. And I know that the related services professionals are all being challenged now to basically connect what they do to the extent to which it really improves the achievement of students. And I think, for instance, the American Speech and Hearing Association has done a wonderful job of showing how the work that local speech pathologists do, how it connects to literacy, and how through that connection to literacy and the use of language, it affects all the other achievement aspects of what they do. School psychologists in particular have worked very, very hard to connect their related services to how it affects a student's achievement and the outcomes that students have over time. So related services, everyone in the related services professions needs to think not just about how they're meeting individual needs of kids specific to eligibility for related services, but also, and very importantly, overall, how what they do actually connects to improving student achievement, especially where they can offer evidence from the research that the kinds of things that they offer have a direct connection to affecting student achievement and whether or not kids are going to exit school as successful learners and good members of their community.
That's a really interesting perspective. When we've spoken with clinicians on the ground about this, they get the shift that's happening, and one of the things they say is just there's some logistical things in the way. My group sizes are too big to be effective and so on. So it'll be very interesting to watch this play out and see how schools and districts reorganize or don't reorganize their related services programs to adapt.
Well, and it's very important, I think, when people talk about, caseloads, et cetera, to what extent they can connect research related to lower caseloads, et cetera, as producing a better result. You don't want to fall into the trap of simply saying, teachers would say, if I had fewer kids in my class, I could get better results. Well, the research hasn't borne that out. So you want to be careful to not make it a labor relations issue, but make it more an issue based upon research about what's connected to student achievement.
ASH actually has some good data on this for SLPs. I haven't seen similar data for OTs or other related service professionals. For caseloads of 40, 13% of students don't make progress on the ASH and NOM scale, whereas for caseloads over 60, 35% or more than double do not make progress towards their goals. So there is interesting and good data there from ASHA for any listeners who are interested. So last question here. Go ahead, please.
Go ahead.
Last question. Does RDA mean even more paperwork?
Absolutely not, unless you happen to be a state agency employee, in which case you're working on trying to develop the state systemic improvement plan and identify that state-identified measurable result. But even in that instance, it doesn't result in more paperwork because OSEP requires you to submit it digitally. So we're not about trying to fill out more forms necessarily, unless I said you're a state agency employee, but it's really around trying to get people to look at the existing data differently. So no, a good clear answer, no, not more paperwork.
I think that's the answer that everyone who tuned in wanted to hear, but we'll also give our condolences and our thanks to the state folks who are struggling through this for all of us. So that's all the information we have time for today. A very special thank you to Dr. Alan Coulter for helping us all to better understand results-driven accountability. And also thank you to all of you who attended and contributed wonderful questions. If you have additional questions for Alan about RDA or today's presentation, you can reach him at acoulter@lsuhsc.edu. That's ACOULTER@lsuhsc.edu. This is the third and final webinar in our fall series, SPED Expectations. Thousands of educators, SLPs, OT school counselors, behavior specialists, and parents have joined us over the past several months to learn from some of the top minds in special education. Legal expert Julie Weatherly kicked off the series back in September with her top legal tips for staying out of due process. She was followed by Dr. Barry Prezant in October, who shared his strategies to help educators forge better relationships with families of students with special needs. If you want to watch these online or replay them at your convenience, you can find the full series and slides for each presentation at plearn.co/SPED-expectations. That's plearn.co/SPED expectations. And finally, thank you from everyone at Presence Learning. We are committed to unlocking the potential of children through live online therapy from high-quality SLPs, OTs, and mental health professionals. Please watch for details about our upcoming spring webinar series entitled Special Agents of Change. We have an exciting lineup of speakers, including Trip Hawkins, the founder of Electronic Arts, who will be speaking about how to connect social and emotional learning and gaming, Dr. Shari Robertson, who will present on new approaches to literacy, Dr. Marty Burns, who will share strategies for working with middle and high school students, and Dr. Frances Stetson, who will share her leadership ideas on the future of special education. Watch for more details on the series starting in January. Please remember, your feedback on these webinar programs is very important to us and to the quality of webinars that we can offer. At the conclusion of today's program, you'll be directed to a feedback survey for today's webinar. Please let us know what you thought about today's program. Watch your email for a certificate of attendance and links to the recording, as well as slides for today's program. Please share them with your colleagues. For CEU questions, email us at ceu@presencelearning.com. For more info or a live demo of Presence Learning's online therapy services, email us at schools@presencelearning.com. Thanks, and have a great day.